FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Well, no other luminary than John Maynard Keynes said, "There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction and does it in a manner which not one man in a million is able to diagnose." Well, fortunately, thanks to the person you're about to hear from, the number of people who see it happening in society now is far greater than 1 in a million. Talking about James Turk, co-author of The Money Bubble and founder of goldmoney.com. James, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Kerry. It's always great to speak with you.
Hey, so we see this debauchery happening on a scale that if you and I had spoken, if we had known each other in, say, 2005, and I told you that the world's central banks were going to literally create tens of trillions of currency units over the next decade, you would have said, you know, the bus to Bellevue is over there. I think you should hop on it, right?
Yeah, possibly. Although I must admit that, in my 4.5 decades of finance, I've seen some crazy things. So I probably would have left open a 5% probability. But, even more bizarre, Kerry, is that after creating all of this newly printed money out of thin air, I'm surprised that they're still able to keep the system going. I don't think it's going to continue much longer at present because you can see all of the strains, and that's what the money bubble is all about. But, it is surprising that they've managed to, as they say, kick the can down the road a little bit further. Unfortunately, that road is heading for the cliff.
And you're an average guy. You're working for a living. You got some kids to support. You're praying that you're going to have enough money to send them to college. And you're just trying every day to work to not go bankrupt. And you can't really think about these lofty matters about money supply and debauchery of the currency. And then a guy like Michael Lewis comes along, who wrote Liar's Poker in '89 and, has written a lot of seminal financial works. And he comes up with this thing, and it just says, the system is rotten to the core. It's ripping you off. It's ripping off everybody in society, regardless who you might be. And you got to be ready to just throw your hands up, James, and say, what am I going to do here? Why do I bother?
Yeah, the middle class is really getting hurt badly in so many different ways. They can't earn any interest on their savings. And that's destructive to the economy because the middle class are the backbone of a capitalist society. That's where the savings are. That's where the production is. And then the government lies to them about what the inflation rate is. The inflation rate is much higher than what the government reports. So you get this growing distrust in government, this growing distrust in institutions. And it's really quite frightening in terms of the potential implications, because I do believe that the dollar will pop. That's the whole, will collapse. Let's say that's the whole point of the money bubble, and the money bubble eventually popping. And we do go back to basically sound money, what existed not only in the United States, but around the world until 1971, which is, of course, tying paper to a anchor like gold and or silver. But before we get to that popping, you see a lot of crazy things happening. And like Michael Lewis, who's a great author, was saying in his book, things are rigged. And unfortunately, the middle class is bearing the brunt of that.
Yeah, it really is. And in your book here, at the end, in the appendix, where I was reading, or right before the appendix, you said rebuilding from the rubble, and you have a quote from Ludwig von Mises, one of my personal heroes in the whole world of economics and really of explaining the world in a way that makes you understand that you really can't understand what's happening, and that's why you need to have government stay the hell out of things because they don't know. They can't fix a price, whether it's for labor, whether it's for gold, whether it's for anything other than perhaps taxes to make the thing run. And even that they're not too good at, and expect the market to not react and it to have unintended consequences. And yeah, here it is in your epilogue. And here's a quote from Ludwig von Mises, and I hesitate to read things, but it is impossible to grasp the meaning of sound money if one does not realize that it was devised as an instrument for the protection of civil liberties against despotic inroads on the part of governments. Ideologically, it belongs in the same class with political constitutions and bills of rights. And that is an extremely powerful quote, and yet 1 in a million, do they understand it?
Yeah, it's really unfortunate, that von Mises, who in my mind was the greatest economist of the 20th century and perhaps one of the top economists throughout history, gets so little attention in schools these days. But, there is this website, Mises.org, which is one of the world's most popular economic websites. And fortunately, his teachings and his books, they're becoming more popular, and people around the world are starting to understand that the economics that the world has been following for so long, basically Keynesian economics, is totally heading in the wrong direction. And we have to go back to the way the world should be working, which of course sound money is an important element of it. It's, the interesting thing about that Mises quote, tying it to civil liberties, is that, people think that, voting can control government, or writing to your congressman can control government. But the only way you can control government is to have sound money. And that's the point that Mises is making. Because if you don't have sound money, government can just print money to abandon, print until eventually the currency collapses and then you have chaos. And we've seen this dozens and dozens of times in the past 100 years where countries have moved away from tying the currency to a sound money like gold or silver. You ultimately get the currency collapse. And the tragic thing, Kerry, is oftentimes currency collapse can create political chaos in addition to economic chaos. And, that is quite worrying given the state of affairs that we have in the United States today.
Yeah, and while the world has been following Keynes for sure, Keynes never was an advocate of quantitative easing and the policies that are taking place now. I mean, he advocated, while in recessions or depressions, to use fiscal stimulus in the form of expanded government spending, which we know is kind of useless, and cutting taxes, and during prosperous times to pay that money back. This type of thing that we're going through now wasn't in the Keynesian playbook at all.
Yeah, there are a lot of things that are being done today that are used in the Keynesian name. But one of the things Keynes was in favor of was increasing control of the state, increasing control of government. And, that's what we've got. So when you destroy the currency, or you move away from sound money, if you debauch the currency, like Keynes said, he recognizes that, you're going to destroy society. And all of the fraud, the dishonesty and everything that we're seeing today is a direct result of having currency circulating in place of money. Because what we have today, Kerry, what we use in commerce, it's not really money. It's a money substitute. And, that's the key point of the money bubble. We're going to learn that what we're using today in transactions really isn't money. And what we call money is a money substitute. Now, ultimately, that will be, that's the money bubble, and that's ultimately will pop. And I think the consequences of that are potentially quite severe.
Yeah, and there were people who figured this out in 1971 when the gold window was closed, that once the dollar was disconnected from gold, from any store of value, there was a lot of money to be made in it because prices of hard goods, commodities, real estate were going to go up, as well as gold and silver, which it has dramatically. And they cleaned up. And now those same people are probably putting a lot of their assets into gold and silver because they're getting ready for the reverse to happen as the system travels back to gold and silver, which it inevitably does, right? Every system eventually winds up back where it started, right? I mean, eventually the system has to return to some semblance of sanity where you have to restrict the politician's ability to create new units, currency units at will or at whim, right?
Yeah. The interesting thing about 1971 is that President Nixon said that the link to gold was only going to be temporarily suspended. Even he recognized that you had to have a monetary system tied to gold. And because we've not yet reestablished that link that existed from the time of the Constitution up until 1971, we're seeing these problems today. It's the same problems that the framers went through. And it's one of the reasons why they created the Constitution, to form a more perfect union, because the first currency of the country, the Continental, collapsed because there was no discipline on the monetary process. They had the foresight to recognize that you have to tie currency to gold and or silver. And that's what they did in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 and 10, and then reconfirmed that point in the Coinage Act of 1792, signed into law by George Washington. And so it was until 1971.
So what about cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin? You write about them in the book. What's your take on it?
Yeah, it's interesting because, currency evolves. Money is always the same thing. It does the same thing today it did, 1,000 years ago. It enables us to communicate with everybody else when we go into the marketplace to fulfill our needs and our wants. And what we use in the marketplace is currency. And currency has moved from, animals in ancient prehistory times to weights of gold, to coins, eventually to paper, then to checks, and checking accounts, and then to wire transfers, then plastic cards, debit cards and credit cards, and now cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies, in my view, are just a technological advancement in the form of currency. And we talk about Bitcoin, and whether Bitcoin will be, the best cryptocurrency in 5 years' time, who knows? It does have first mover advantage. But regardless, the point is that I think cryptocurrencies and the technology they bring to the marketplace is an important development. And I think cryptocurrencies have a bright future.
Yeah, no doubt. And we're going to talk more about this up next on the Financial Survival Network. We're talking with Gold Money's James Turk.
FSN Radio.
Do you have Medicare or health insurance through your employer? If so, listen up. The healthcare reform wasn't written to save the healthcare industry or even to lower healthcare costs. Shoot, it isn't even designed to insure the uninsured. It's just a temporary political byproduct. Like a flat rock you step on in a swiftly moving stream, Obamacare is just a means to an end. Want to learn more about Obama's ultimate objective? Then you'll want to review our latest research presentation found on oclies.com. In it, a health expert and industry insider explains what you think you know about caring for your health is about to drastically change in 2014. Plus, he details the simple steps you could take to save thousands of dollars per year in health costs. It's free for you to preview at oclies.com. Don't waste time. What you don't know about the healthcare reform could hurt you and your family.
The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
And we are back. So, James, looking at the road ahead here, there really is no alternative but collapse and then some reconstitution or rediscovery of, hey, maybe this gold is not a barbarous relic after all. So what happens after the collapse?
First of all, the collapse is not inevitable. As I said before, Nixon suspended the link to gold only temporarily. We can go back and reestablish that link and go back to the way the monetary system worked more or less, let's say up until 1933 when Roosevelt confiscated gold. blaming the Great Depression on the gold standard instead of where it really should have been put on the feet of the bankers who created too much of a credit boom in the 1920s. The gold has been blamed for so many things incorrectly. We need to start analyzing the problems that we face and put the blame in the right place. And the right place is the way the banking system operates. But if we go back to what the Constitution requires, a collapse is not inevitable. It's going to be painful, without any doubt, but it'll be less painful if we continue down this road of creating money out of thin air, because when you go over the cliff, you have severe economic consequences that are going to be much more difficult than by going back to what we know works. And what we know works is that gold and silver have been money for 5,000 years. The system that we're using is only 40 years long. It's not working. It's not working in the U.S., and we've seen how it hasn't worked in other countries around the world as well. So, you cannot predict the future, Kerry, but you know that when you're heading in a direction and the direction is the wrong way, and that road is heading toward a cliff, sooner or later, you're going to go over that cliff. And what we as individuals have to do is to prepare for that moment, assuming the politicians don't turn the ship of state around and start heading things in the right direction. But I see no indication whatsoever, not only in the U.S., but basically throughout the world, of the leadership necessary to reestablish a sound monetary system.
Yeah, the most surprising thing to me, James, is that China is the biggest money printer on the planet. And here they're hoarding gold like there's no tomorrow, and yet they're printing more money than the rest of the world combined. That was surprising to me.
Well, there might be a certain logic to what they're doing. They're playing the system for what it is, but they're preparing for the future when the system collapses by buying gold. If they become a major accumulator of physical metal, and I believe they have become that over the past 10 to 15 years, particularly over the last few years when we've seen huge amounts of gold coming out of central banks in the Western countries and flowing to Asia. And I'm talking, large amounts of physical metal. So, if the monetary system, this paper monetary system we have that we've been using for 40 years does collapse, and I think it will, China is preparing itself for that. And the Western countries, unfortunately, by dishoarding all of this gold and selling it to China to try to make believe that the existing system still has a long time to go to it, has more shelf life, is a serious mistake. And I think that's going to put the West at a major disadvantage as this money bubble continues to play itself out.
Yeah, so they're basically going to be left running the show then, effectively, the East. They're going to have all the gold, and he who has the gold makes the rules, huh?
Yeah, that's basically it. The history of the world is that empires rise and fall. And there's no doubt that the American empire, which shouldn't even be an empire in the first place, it should be a republic, but that's been long gone, is in a declining mode. And typically it occurs when you have military expansion beyond the capacity of the country to finance that military expansion. And another element that typically appears is the creation of paper money, which ultimately destroys the currency and the economy of that empire. So, yeah, again, we don't know how these things are going to play out. We can't specifically predict the future, but we can look at trends, and we can follow those trends to some logical conclusions. And one logical conclusion is that just like the mantle was handed from the British Empire to the American Empire, from the 19th century to the 20th century. The mantle is in the process of being handed from America to China. And it looks like China will be the dominant economy and the dominant country in the 21st century, based on trends that we've seen so far.
Yeah, the one thing, though, is when they have bank runs in China, it's not like a bank run in the U.S. where everybody kind of stands there orderly and waits for the bank to print out a FDIC check. In China, they don't take things so calmly. So they're going to have a balancing act to get through this money bubble when it really does melt down. That the West is used to this crisis management mode. I don't think China really quite has its arms around what it's like when all those banks shut down at once.
Yeah, and to a certain extent, they have the problem that all big empires have. It's assimilating a lot of people under one form of control. There are independence movements in various parts of China, and there's always the potential for political uncertainty that can disrupt economic activity over there. And there's no doubt about it, Kerry, that the Chinese banks have a lot of bad loans that they made to real estate developers. We've seen these reports about ghost towns. They put a lot of money into bricks and mortar, but there's nobody living in these towns that are completely empty, which is hard to believe. But it's just an example of how things get when banks expand too much credit. It's like what happened in the 19th century with the expansion of the railroads. A lot of railroads were built across the United States. A lot of it was financed by bank money, and ultimately you had a collapse because it just wasn't economic to support all of these railroad tracks, all over the world or all over the country. It just wasn't economic, and the debts couldn't be repaid, and consequently you had various banking crises throughout the latter part of the 19th century, and culminating perhaps in the crisis of 1907, which was triggered by the San Francisco earthquake and disrupted rail traffic, between East and West Coast. So China is it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, but there's no doubt that China has arrived on the world scene once again. It's been a major player in history, and it is a major player again today.
It was the world's, I think, second largest economy right before the beginning of the 20th century, and then it got involved in its internal problems, and we all know what happened then. And it spent all of the 20th century climbing back from the bottom of the bottom. And, like you say, now it's arrived. We'll see what they do with their newfound power. But there's plenty of opportunities to blow it, as we've seen in the United States here, because we've been on this self-immolation kick for the past 10 years. That's just, I never thought I'd live to see it.
It's the culmination, though, going back to what Keynes was talking about. If you debauch the currency, you're going to destroy the society. And so it doesn't go back 10 years. It goes back to 1951. When you broke that link to sound money. And again, referring to that Mises quote, you have to have a sound economy, to have a society in which the rule of law is consistent and you have a level playing field. You need sound money. And you have to have discipline on government. If you don't have that discipline on government in terms of what it spends, then you're ultimately going to tip the balance in favor of the state and away from the freedom of the individual. And
then it's all downhill from there, which you're absolutely right. You can really trace it back further than 1971. You can go back to the 60s and really Vietnam, and so much that went on during that decade. And it was the culmination of that led to the closing of the gold window. I always ask James, why didn't they just raise the price of gold to $100 an ounce and just buy in more gold? That's what I always ask.
That's a good question. We were talking earlier about the problems of the 1930s, that banks extended too much credit in the 1920s, and that created the Great Depression. What President Roosevelt did is he devalued the dollar. He raised the price of gold from $20.67 to $35. Nixon could have done the same thing. He could have raised the price of gold from $35 to, like you say, $100. Maybe $70 would have been enough, or $80 would have been enough, and restored order that way. But I think by that time, government had already sensed that government could increase its own power by breaking the link to gold completely and going to a total, fiat currency system, giving government the power to create money out of thin air without any discipline on how much money could be created. So I think, the trend was already in place to move in that direction. And I think, looking at it from a bigger picture, Kerry, it's sort of, what happened in the 20th century. The 20th century was an increasing power of the state.
Yeah.
And so getting control of the monetary system was just basically part of that. Entirely different than the way the world had operated pretty much up to that moment in time.
Yeah, you're right. I see that. I guess I'm just stuck in that what if mode. If only. And there was an inevitability that the link to gold and the dollar would be broken. And it just happened during Nixon's reign, and that was it. And on that note, so if we want to buy your book, where do we find it? Gold Money, tell us about that.
Yeah, the book is called The Money Bubble, What to Do Before It Pops. I've co-authored it with John Rubino, and it has a lot of not only analysis of where we are and how we got to the situation, but what specific recommendations that people can consider when they look at their own portfolio and what they need to do. If they agree with the analysis of the book that the present system is unsustainable and that there are going to be some financial and monetary changes in the not too distant future. It's available on Amazon. It's also available from your local bookstores. Again, it's called the money bubble, what to do before it pops. And Gold Money is an online way to buy and sell and store gold and silver in different countries around the world. We're based over here in Europe. I'm speaking to you from London at the moment. And what Gold Money is doing is it's safeguarding about $1.5 billion of precious metals that we own, or that our customers own, 23,000 customers in over 100 different countries around the world. Remarkable from, and how long has Gold Money been around now, James? We launched in 2001, so we've been operating now for 13 years. Wow,
that's remarkable. Well, thanks so much for being on. Of course, we got links in the show notes to this interview. It's always a pleasure, James, and hey, good luck with the book. I've read it, and I consider it must-reading for what's going on in the world right now and for what you need to do to prepare for it. So talk to you again soon. Be well.
Okay, you too, Kerry. Thank you very much.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.